Hello, everyone, and welcome to Viking. Today is the unofficial 21st video, the official 27th video, and the final video in my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is the genocide of California's Native American peoples. Now, before I get into the video, I want to preface this by saying that much like the previous video on the Oregon Trail and the colonization of the Pacific Northwest by the United States, this video is going to be slightly different in terms of timeline than most of the videos in the series. Because most of the videos in the series go from the beginning of the United States up until around 1848 to 1850-ish CE, which is the time period that I have designated as the time period where the early imperial expansion of the United States has happened. Um, that being said, this video and again the previous video go from around the 1848-ish CE well into the late 1800s and early 1900s. Again, much like the previous video. And the reason for that is because while the genocide of California's Native American peoples at the hands of the United States begin within 1848 CE, and a little bit before, it continues well on into uh, the late 1800s and early 1900s. Um, and so the reason I am including it in the series is because it begins within that time frame, the end of that time frame of the early U.S. imperial expansion. All right, so with that in mind, one of the first things I always like to point out in these videos is that when people hear terms of, like, say, California, the United States, etc., geographic terms, political terms, what have you, um, people tend to think of how these things look now in the modern day. For example, California, which of course, as you see here on this map, which of course is not an incorrect way to think about it. After all, California, for example, has had its political borders for around 150-ish years or so. I mean, there's been some fluctuation, but generally, um, these borders, we'll say more like 100 years or so. But still, these borders have looked this way uh, longer than literally anyone who, who's alive now has lived. There's nobody alive now that knows California uh, any other way. That being said, that is not the full picture. The state of California in the United States only took on its current political borders after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, therefore, in order to better understand the full picture of how the state of California took on its shape that we know it as today, we need to go a little bit further back in time. Okay, so with that in mind, I have another disclaimer to go over, and that is that due to the scope and complexity of the genocide of California's Native American peoples, this video will be unable to cover the event in its entirety. Instead, this video will focus on the primary actions and events that constitute the genocide of California's Native American peoples. Therefore, to fully understand the full scope of the genocide, of California's Native American peoples, it is highly recommended for viewers to consult the sources cited in the video's description and comments. And there's also a very important trigger warning to go over because this video will cover disturbing subject matter such as sexual assault, abuse, and genocide. And it's these are things that go on throughout the entirety of the event that is the genocide of California's Native American peoples. So I will not have time to stop and warn everyone each time these subjects come up. So it's very important now to know as you're beginning the video that these things will be discussed throughout the video. So if these are things that trigger you, that cause you more discomfort than they do normally, etc. it's very understandable for you to stop now. Um, so, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. So, one very important thing that we need to go over is what did California, or what we know as California now, look like prior to European colonization? Well, for one thing, California was settled by the various pre-Clovis cultures starting around sometime roughly between 30,000 BCE up until around 11,100 BCE. And what I mean by that is that's when the migration and settlement of the region occurred or began to occur. uh, with the peopling of the Americas going about currently, based on our best archaeological evidence, which we'll get into in a second, happening between sometime between 30,000 to 20,000 years before present. And this happened a couple of different ways. The most famously known way is via the Bering Land Bridge, wherein peoples from East Asia migrated across a um, land bridge that was present due to the lower sea levels, and then migrated on foot into North America and then eventually South America. And then there is also a much earlier, less well known, though it's becoming increasingly more well known over the past couple of decades, route that was taken by boat, where individuals from East Asia used boats to hug the coastlines of Russia, the Bering Land Bridge, and the Americas to, of course, settle in the Americas. It's Here's an example of the boats that they would have used, and this is known as the Kelp Highway, uh, named for a route that was abundant with various food resources such as kelp and fish and other marine food sources that the ancient ancestors of the Native Americans who rode on the boats along the Kelp Highway could utilize to feed themselves. And here's some more examples of sort of the various food sources they could have utilized and had access to, and most certainly did utilize and have access to along the Kelp Highway. Uh, on top of the fact that they did most certainly hunt megafauna like the mammoth and mastodon. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the best archaeological evidence we have for the earliest time period of the settlement of North America uh, via the Kelp Highway comes from the White Sands area of New Mexico, White Sands National Park. And the evidence for this is discussed in this paper from the journal Science, authored by Jeffrey S. Pagati et al., titled Independent Age Estimates Resolve the Controversy of Ancient Human Footprints at White Sands. And what the Pagati et al. Examined at White Sands National Park were a series of footprints, as you can see here, that were embedded and fossilized in the sands of the White Sands National Park. And what they did is they took some various plant matters, specifically rupia seeds, um, and used carbon 14 dating to determine their age, as well as various other types of dating. And the age that they determined using the rupia seeds as well as the terrestrial pollen from cone bearing and fruit bearing plants was an age of around 21 to 23,000 years ago, give or take. Plus or minus a few years is what we usually say when we look at carbon 14 dating. And you can see that in this table here and here. And then we have so that was real quick, that this is the best evidence of the earliest time period of the settlement of the Americas. I mean, there's some evidence that dates earlier than this, but those are still being debated and are not as concrete as this. But then we also have other sites, such as the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho, which is talked about in this paper in the journal Science Advances by Lauren G. Davis et al., titled "The Dating of a Large Tool Assemblage at Cooper's Ferry Site, Idaho." To 15,785 calibrated years before present, extends the age of stemmed points in the Americas. And uh, so what Lauren G. Davis et al. Looked at was again the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho along the Salmon River. Uh, and here's a map of that site here. And they specifically looked at one, the projectile points that were found there that were stemmed projectile points that were not Clovis points. It's important to point out these are prior to the development of the Clovis point. Um, and they used carbon 14 dating from cultural pits as well as hearths to date the site to around 15,719 years before present. There is a date right here that shows 16,675 years before present. But regardless, they dated it to sometime between 15 to 16,000 years ago. And again, using geochronology and radiocarbon dating to determine these dates, taking these things from hearths, freshwater mussel shells, etc. And then we have, after the pre-Clovis cultures settled in North America, the most famous culture, or one of the most famous archaeological cultures, began to develop, and that is the Clovis culture, which lived in California between 11,100 and 10,800 BCE. Um, and these are people who were, again, much like the pre-Clovis peoples, hunter-gatherers, only this time they predominantly focused on foot travel, um, following megafauna bands to hunt them. Um, as you can see here by this mammoth backpack or mastodon backpack this individual is wearing. And this culture is most well known for its very distinct type of projectile point, uh, which was found called Clovis points, which are distinct for their leaf shape, as well as the flute or flute. Sometimes there are two, but generally it's a singular flute that is broken off into the side of one of the sides of the Clovis points. And here's some more examples here. And as you can see here, they can very much vary in size. And the Clovis culture was all over North America, including California, as you can see here on this map. Um, and then, of course, after that, the Clovis culture would develop into the various different Native American peoples of North America, including the Native American peoples of California, who lived in California between 10,800 BCE to 1542 CE, and of course, well after. And so that brings us to the next thing. Prior to European colonization, California was home to roughly 100 diverse Native American nations, which you can see here on this map. And of course, some of them were larger than others, is to be expected. But regardless, it's still something to be noted that this was a very diverse, very populated region of North America. And of course, with that diverse populations and the various diverse Native American nations, that also comes with another fact that the Native American peoples of California lived in diverse environments, such as the Pacific Coast, the Sonoran Desert, and the Great Basin. And of course, these all came with various different lifeways. The people on the Pacific coast would oftentimes fish and hunt whales and things, and utilized boat travel and boat cultures, which you can see here. The people in the desert utilized different methods and hunted things like rabbits, etc. And we'll get more in their foodways in a second. Um, but you can see that here. And then, of course, the people in the Great Basin utilize also different methods and foods, such as harvesting wild rice, which is a very important food staple for the Native American peoples of the Great Basin. If you want more information on the archaeology and the history of Native American subsistence ways, or agriculture, etc., I have already done a video on that I will include in the iCard. Uh, and of course, much like they lived in various diverse environments, the Native American peoples of California lived in a variety of villages and dwellings, which you can see here, 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 uh, here, and here. And again, due to their diverse environments, the Native American peoples of California hunted a diverse population of animals such as elk, deer, and dolphins, as well as whales, and harvested a variety of aquatic resources such as fish, clams, and oysters. They harvested a variety of wild plants such as acorns, buckeyes, and yampa. And the Native American peoples of California used controlled burns to control the growth of forests in order to promote the growth of desired wild plant foods and to promote large populations of desired game animals such as elk. We know this from various pieces of archaeological evidence, such as this paper in the journal, the journal known as the Holocene, by R. Scott Anderson and Roger D. Stillick Jr., titled "800 Years of Vegetation, Change, Fire, and Human Settlement in the Sierra Nevada of California." Where in this study, in this paper, they look at specifically the Sierra Nevada and the Yosemite National Park. That is Anderson and Stillick Jr. In investigating this area, they were able to get several carbon 14 dates, as you can see here, with some coming, of course, from 1963, but others going back as far as 830 years. Some coming from wood and others from peat and wood. And again, they got this from the Wa Meadow Core. Anybody from California watching this, please feel free to correct me on my pronunciation. And they were able to also determine using pollen, as well as other pieces of carbon and like ash layers and such, to determine the most common types of pollen at any given period of time, as you can see here on this graph, and determine, which goes back to at least 1300 CE, all the way up to the year 2000, just 25 years ago now. And you can see that diagram here, looking at the dominant pollen of various herbs, and native and introduced riparian pollen and spore types found in the meadow, as well as the number of charcoal remains and plant microfossils found in the area as well. And here's a diagram that indicates the local fires based on the charcoal analysis, looking at the time periods. So what all these pieces of evidence told Anderson and Stillett Jr. is that, one, starting around 800 years ago, the ponderosa pine mixed conifer forest grew around meadows, and that there was little change in upland vegetation until the arrival of white Americans in the 1800s. And then they further go on to state that they suspect that the Miwok and their ancestors used controlled burns to manipulate the meadow and the vicinity around the meadow by frequently burning the meadow surface, and that starting around with their arrival around 700 years ago, there was an increase in charcoal influx to the settlements during the period, which was known to be wetter and cooler. So again, archaeological evidence showing that the Miwok and other Native American peoples living in the area used controlled burns to manipulate the environment to their benefit. On top of the use of controlled fire to control the growth of forests and the harvesting of wild vegetables and wild foods such as acorns and buckeyes, many, though not all, Native American nations in California would farm corn, squash, and beans. On top of this, the Native American peoples of California would participate in a continent-wide trade network, which you can see here on this map here, with trade items including but not being limited to obsidian glass, ceremonial pipes, as well as ornamental shells. Another important thing to mention is that while warfare did occur between the Native American peoples of California, archaeological evidence as well as textual evidence from the earliest encounters between Europeans and the Native American peoples of California suggests that warfare was incredibly rare. Though, of course, this does vary in itself a little bit as well because some Native American groups and nations in the Southwest, as well as the Great Basin, most certainly did have some degree of warfare that was more frequent than, say, the heart of what is now California. But the broad strokes still suggest that warfare was fairly rare in California prior to European colonization. Which now brings us to our next section, Spanish colonization. So the first Europeans to explore the California coast are members of a Spanish, were members of a Spanish sailing expedition led by Captain Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which is now what is now modern day Mexico. Cabrillo's expedition would make contact with small Native American villages along California's coast, and Cabrillo's expedition would only stay for a short period of time and did not go further inland or to the far north of California, with this encounter happening on September 28th, 1542 CE. After that, the coast of California would become connected to the Spanish Empire's Manila galleon trade on sometime in 1565 CE. And you can see a map of that Manila galleon trade here. Then the coast of California would be further explored by Sebastian Vizcaino. And I do apologize, I'm sure I butchered that a little bit. Who would name give San Diego Bay its name, and he would also map areas suitable for future colonization, with his explorations happening in 1602 CE. Then, eventually, full scale colonization would happen when Catholic Spanish missionaries, led by Franciscan administrator uh, Junipero Serrera, and military forces under the command of Gaspar de Portola, would launch an expedition into California, intending to spread the Catholic faith among the region's Native American peoples and establish and expand the reach of the Spanish Empire, with this expedition happening between 1769 and 1770 CE. As a result of the Portola expedition, 21 missions would be established in California, or what would eventually become known as Alta California, and we'll get into that in a second. And then 31 missions would be established in Baja California. On top of this, military outposts would be constructed alongside the missions to house soldiers sent to protect the missionaries. Then the Spanish Empire would divide California into the provinces of Alta California and Baja California, which you can see on this map here. During the Spanish colonial period, the Native American peoples of California were often forced to live at Spanish missions and convert to Christianity. Roughly 87,000 baptisms and 24,000 marriages were conducted at the missions. On top of this, the Native American peoples of California were forced to participate in the brutal encomienda system. So, for those of you who aren't aware, I've talked about the encomienda system a few times in my videos, but the encomienda system was essentially it was slavery in all but name. So the idea was that Spanish settlers would protect, care for, and Christianize Native Americans, and the Native Americans would work for a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. The reality, of course, was much different. Spanish settlers would force long labor. They never paid Native American workers. They often failed to and often outright refused to protect Native Americans and would seize Native American lands. And Native Americans would die from diseases and harsh living and working conditions. In theory, the encomienda ended after the Catholic Church protested, as well as after multiple Native American rebellions, such as the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680 CE. However, abuses would continue under the replacement repartimiento system. Essentially, the repartimiento system was the encomienda system under a different name. And on top of this, Native American laborers were directly employed in a quasi feudal like system at haciendas, large landed estates, by hacienda owners, where they were often overworked and horribly mistreated. Furthermore, the population of California's Native American peoples would witness a massive drop in population due to the introduction of diseases, which would rapidly spread while Native Americans were forced into close quarters at missions, as well as due to torture, overworking, and malnourishment at the missions. Roughly 63,000 Native Americans died at the missions alone, and this happened between 1769 and 1832 CE. Now, one important thing to point out is that despite Spanish attempts to eradicate the cultural practices of California's Native American peoples, the Native American peoples of California were able to maintain a large amount of their cultures. And evidence for this, archaeological evidence for this, is found and mentioned in a journal article in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology by Sitha N. Reddy, titled "Feeding Family and Ancestors: Persistence of Traditional Native American Lifeways During the Mission Periods in Coastal Southern California." And so, what Reddy did is they looked at this area around here, around San Pedro Bay and Santa Monica Bay and surrounding islands, and looked at various mission sites. And in doing this, they found archaeological remains of a variety of native indigenous food sources, so specifically wild grasses such as little barley, maygrass, and other wild grasses, wild legumes, and other small native plant seeds. And you can see that again in this table here, as well as here. And so that in itself shows that, at least to some degree, there was a concerted attempt to maintain some of their cultural practices while being brutally forced to assimilate and convert to Christianity by the Spanish Empire. Now, that being said, the missions also introduced European invasive plant species as well as cattle grazing practices that would significantly transform the California landscape and would alter the Native American relationship to the land, as well as key plant and animal species that had been integral to their ways of life and worldviews for thousands of years. And we can see this talked about in journals, in journal articles, such as one journal article from the Journal of San Diego History by Paul Albert Laxon, titled "Born of Horses, Missionaries, Indigenous Vaqueros, Ecological and Ecological Expansion During the Spanish Colonization of California," where this paper, as you can see in the title, focuses on the introduction of horses, which were the Spanish Empire introduced horses in this area here on this map. And after the introduction of horses, you can see on this table here the number of Native Americans who rode horses, but not only rode horses, but also acted as caretakers for horses, mules, cattle, and oxen, and other Spanish introduced livestock began to increase fairly quickly, going from just 2 in 1804 CE to 21 in 1805 CE to 37 in 1810 CE, and then going down a little to 25 in 1815 CE. And you can see some picture examples of these Native American vaqueros here and here. And actually, let's go back to that for a second. So, for those of you who aren't aware, vaqueros are actually the origin of what we know as the cowboy in United States culture. The cowboys that you see in movies, like say, or movies, uh, various westerns, but also TV shows such as, say, Lonesome Dove. Um, this is where they originate from. So we actually have Native Americans as well as Spanish in the Spanish Empire, as well as Mexican citizens and Mexican culture to thank for the origins of the United States cowboy. Now this brings us to our next section, the rise of the Mexican Republic. So, inspired by the French and Haitian revolutions, insurgents such as Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla, Ignacio Allende, and Ignacio Lopez Rayon would go on to overthrow Spanish rule in Mexico over a 10-year period of time, or sorry, 11-year period of time between 1810 to 1821 CE. Sometimes they would work together, sometimes they would work independently, and of course, it's important to note these were by no means the only revolutionaries in Mexico, Spanish Mexico at the time. And they would establish the first Mexican Empire in 1821 CE, but it would only last until 1823 CE, where it would then be replaced by the first Mexican Republic, which would last between 1824 and 1835 CE. And here's the first Mexican Republic here. And of course, as you can see, California was most certainly part of the first Mexican Republic. However, on October 23rd, 1835 CE, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would overthrow the first Mexican Republic and would establish the Centralist Republic of Mexico and would insert himself as the essentially dictator. He would call himself president, but again, essentially the dictator of the Centralist Republic of Mexico. And then it's very important to note that the treatment of California's Native American peoples would remain largely the same in the Republic of Mexico as the treatment in the Spanish Empire. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the Mexican American War and the arrival of the United States. So, in the United States, many white Americans would begin to believe that all Mexican territory should be brought into the United States as part of the growing philosophy of manifest destiny. Essentially, the idea that it was the United States God given right and God divined right, however you want to put it, their divine right to essentially expand across all of North America. The common term was from sea to sea. And under this idea, President James K. Polk and the United States would begin to make plans to obtain not just disputed parts of Texas, which was generally the main focus at the time, because many white Americans believed that Texas was given to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. But he would also begin to make plans to gain the Mexican provinces of Nueva Mexico and Alta California. Then, uh, sometime in 1846 CE, the exact date escapes me at the moment, the United States Army and the Mexican armies would clash in the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, which would then lead to Polk using the battles as an excuse to declare war on the Republic of Mexico, with the United States Congress approving the declaration of war on May 13th, 1846 CE. And this would begin a war that would become known as the Mexican American War, which would last between 1846 and 1848 CE. And I've already done a video on the Mexican American War that I will include in the iCard. And here's a map of the Mexican American War here. but not on top of the beginning of the war with Mexico, the Mexican American War, and the attempt to gain the provinces of Nueva Mexico, Texas, and Alta California. The United States would also begin its genocide of California's Native American peoples during the Mexican American War. Specifically, this started when Major John C. Fremont would enter California, leading a survey expedition of 60 white American volunteers, militiamen, and Native American scouts. While in California, Fremont's forces would meet white Americans who claimed that an encampment of 1,000 Native Americans was preparing to attack white settlements. Fremont would then move his men up the Sacramento River in search of the Native Americans on March 30th, 1846 CE. Upon reaching Redding's Ranch, Fremont's force would find a large village of the Wintu Nation on April 5th, 1846 CE. Whereupon Fremont would order an advance on the Wintu village, advancing from three sides on the Wintu, who were unable to flee the camp as the majority of their ranks were women and children, and they were pinned against the river. The men of the Wintu camp would attempt to form a defensive line with the women and children behind them. Fremont would then order his force to give no quarter and would promptly slaughter an estimated 900 Wintu men, women, and children in an event that would become known as the Sacramento River Massacre on April 5th, 1846 CE. And here are some excerpts of eyewitness accounts of the Sacramento River Massacre. The first excerpt comes from the memoirs of Thomas E. Breckinridge. The first two excerpts come from the memoirs of Thomas E. Breckinridge, with excerpt one reading, and I quote, "The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and they commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and paposes were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive." And then the second excerpt reads, "I think that I hate an Indian as badly as anybody and have as good a reason to hate them. But I do not think that I could have assisted in the slaughter. It takes two to fight or quarrel. But in that case, there was but one side fighting and the other side trying to escape." And then the second firsthand account comes from an excerpt of Kit Carson's own life, from Kit Carson's memoir. Kit Carson being a frontiersman, a very famous frontiersman from the time period. In this excerpt from his memoir titled Kit Carson's own story of his life, it reads, and I quote, "During our stay at Lawson's, some Americans that were settled in the neighborhood came in stating that there were about 1,000 Indians in the vicinity making preparations to attack the settlements. Requested assistance of Fremont to drive them back. He and party and some few Americans that lived near started for the Indian encampment. Found them in great force, as was stated. They were attacked. The number killed I cannot say. It was a perfect butchery. Those not killed fled in all directions, and we returned to Lawson's. Had accomplished what we went for and given the Indians such chastisement that it would be long before they ever again would feel like attacking the settlements." So this in itself shows just how brutal these sources right here, just so in itself just how brutal the Sacramento River Massacre was. And here are the sources that I got that information from. After the Sacramento River Massacre, Fremont's force would then move along the Upper Klamath River. Up along the Upper Klamath Lake. Fremont's force would, in doing this, kill any Native American they encountered. While camped at the Upper Klamath Lake, Lieutenant Archibald Giuseppe would arrive from Washington, D.C., delivering a dispatch to Fremont that informed him of the outbreak of the Mexican-American War and ordered Fremont to return to Alta California on May 8th, 1846 CE. Then on May 9th, 1846 CE, in response to Fremont's attacks, roughly 20 warriors from the Klamath Nation would ambush Fremont's force on the Upper Klamath Lake and would kill 3 of Fremont's volunteers. In retaliation for the ambush, Fremont would send Kit Carson to lead an attack on a Klamath village. Carson and his volunteers would kill 14 Klamath in the village in an event known as the Klamath Lake Massacre on May 12, 1846 CE. After the Klamath Lake Massacre, Fremont would then head towards Sutter's Fort. On the way to Sutter's Fort, Fremont would camp near the Bear and Feather Rivers. While camped, Fremont would hear rumors that a local village of the Patwin people of the Wintu Nation were preparing to an attack on settlers. In reality, the village was preparing to harvest crops. But Fremont would take the movements of the Native Americans and the upcoming harvest as signs that the time for the attack was nearing, and would states in his memoirs that he chose to attack them preemptively, killing several Patwin villagers in an event that would become known as the Sutter's Buttes Massacre on sometime in June of 1846 CE. And here is Fremont's personal account of the Sutter's Buttes Massacre. And it reads, and I quote, It was evident from the movements of the Indians that the rumored attack on the settlers was certainly intended, and all signs indicated that the time for it was at hand. The wheat throughout the valley was now dry and ready for the harvest or the torch. Keeping in mind my promises to the settlers, and being now about to move towards Sutter's Fort, where I intended to occupy a more central position, I thought that the time for me too had come. I resolved to anticipate the Indians and strike them a blow which would make them recognize that Castro was far and that I was near. And I judged it expedient to take such precautionary measures as in my forward movement would leave no enemy behind to destroy the strength of my position by cutting off my supply in cattle and break communication with incoming immigrants. Accordingly, early in the morning, I moved quietly out of camp with the great number of men taking the right or western bank of Sacramento. In describing the lower division of the river, I have already mentioned that many rancherias towards the head of its valley. Some of the largest were scattered along the bank of the river, where fish and the abundant acorn bearing trees made a preferred ground. These numbered more men than the smaller rancherias, which lay further out in the valley and among the hills. My movement was unexpected, and riding rapidly up the river, we reached, without discovery, the first rancheria among the hostiles. The scouts who had been sent forward reported the Indians with feathers on their heads and faces painted black, the war color, or their war color, and in the midst of their war ceremonies. Intending to surprise and scatter them, we rode directly upon them, and at this place several Indians were killed in the dispersion. In the panic made by our sudden charge, the Indians jumped into and swam the river, a few escaping into shelter on our side of the river. With scarcely a halt, we rode on towards the other rancherias, and the news of our attack apparently reached these as soon as ourselves, for the Indians were escaping from their villages. As we rode in among them, before the close of the day, nearly all the rancherias had been visited, and the Indians dispersed. As we rode down the hill, which commanded a view of the river plain on which stood the farthest village that we reached, we could see the Indians in the commotion, some running off from the river, and others jumping into it. When we reached the rancheria, the water was dotted with the heads of the Indians swimming across. We had surprised them assembled in the height of their war ceremonies. This put an end to the attack upon the whites. The Indians of the California Valley had their fixed places of habitation where they lived. The tribes on one river were rarely friendly to those on another. They knew I came from the mountains, so they could not take refuge there. That if I should drive them into the upper valley where they would encounter hostile tribes who would destroy them. So that with the return to their villages, the dread of another visitation would keep them on their good behavior. This was a rude but necessary measure to prevent injury to the whites, and it had the effect which I intended. So this can show just the brutality. The source, an account from Fremont, again shows the brutality of his methods and the brutality of his massacres on the Native American peoples of the Wintu Nation and earlier the Klamath Nation. And here's the source that I got this information from. Eventually, on February 2nd, 1848 CE, the United States would win the Mexican American War, and as a result, Mexico would cede territory, including the present day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, and a small portion of Wyoming and a small portion of Oklahoma to the United States. In return, Mexico would receive $15 million, less than half the amount the United States previously offered Mexico for the land before the opening of hostilities. And the United States would agree to assume $3.25 million in debts that the Mexican government owed to the United States, to various United States citizens, mainly businessmen. Now, this brings us to our next section, the United States and the state-sanctioned genocide of California's Native American peoples. So, basically right after the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of California, gold would be discovered in California, resulting in the migration of roughly 120,000 primarily white American colonists to California in search of gold, with the discovery of gold famously being happening in 1849 CE. During this migration, settlers would view Native Americans as obstacles for gold, so they would actively go into villages where they would rape the women and kill the men. Sexual violence against Native American women and young girls was a normal part of white American settler life. Native American women were often forced into prostitution and or sex slavery. Uh, and it was noted that the kidnappings and rapings of Native American women and girls occurred daily and nightly. Then, on September 9th, 1850 CE, California would become a U.S. state, would become a United State. And then on April 22nd, 1850 CE, the California government would pass the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, also known as the Indian Indenture Act, which provided for the apprenticing uh, or indenturing of Native American children to white American settlers, and also punished vagrant Native Americans by hiring them uh, out to the highest bidder at public auctions if the Native Americans could not provide sufficient bond or bail. Now, you'll note all the air quotes I'm doing, and that's because all of this was essentially pomp. It was pomp and theater because all this act did was essentially legalize a form of slavery in California, specifically Native American slavery. So they were not indentured servants, they were not apprentices, they were not hired, they were enslaved. And the provisions of this act that are important to note are Provision 3, where employers were granted the right to obtain children and keep them until they reached 18 years old for men and 15 years old for women. Consent was supposedly required from a parent or a friend in order to gain a certificate of custody. Of course, this was not always the case. Provision 4 required proper treatment of those in custody with fines of not less than $10 for inhumane treatment. Again, not always enforced. Provision 6 stated that complaints may be made before justice of the peace by white persons or Indians, but in no case shall a white man be convicted of any offense upon the testimony of a Native American. Uh, and then Provision 9 stated that if any tribe or village of Indians refused or neglect to obey the laws set by the justices of the peace, the justice of the peace may punish the guilty chiefs and or principal men by reprimand or fine or otherwise reasonably chastise them. And then Provision 13 states that justices may require the chiefs and influential men of any village to apprehend and bring before them uh, or him any Indian charged or suspected for offense. Provision 14 states that when an Indian is convicted of offense before a justice of the peace, punishable by any fine, any white man may, by consent of the judge, give bond for said Indian, conditioned for the payment of said fine and costs, and in such case, the Indian shall be compelled to work for the person, so bailing them out until he is discharged has discharged or canceled the fine assessed against him. So essentially, the person bailing them out can enslave them. Uh, Provision 16 states that an Indian convicted of stealing horses, mules, cattle, or any valuable thing shall be subject to receive any number of lashes not exceeding 25, or shall be subject to a fine not exceeding $200 at the discretion of the court or jury. And then provision 20 stated that any Indian found loitering or strolling about or frequenting public spaces where liquors were sold, begging or leading an immoral or profligate course of life shall be liable to be arrested on the complaint of any reasonable citizen of the county, authorizing and requiring the officer having him in charge or custody to hire out such vagrant within 24 hours to the highest bidder. Again, they will be enslaved. The money received for this hire uh, shall, after deducting the costs and the necessary expenses, be paid into the county treasury to the credit of the Indian fund. But if he have a family, the same shall be appropriated for their use and benefit. And here is the source that I got this information from. Unsurprisingly, as a result of the act, white Americans would take between 10,000 to 27,000 California Native Americans as forced laborers, including 4,000 to 7,000 children. And we can see an example of this forcibly taking of Native Americans as forced laborers in multiple different sources. Specifically, in this case, from in the personal account of George S. Evans, the lieutenant colonel of the Second Cavalry California Volunteers, who was in charge of commanding the Owens River expedition in 1862 CE. And the excerpt from his firsthand account reads, and I quote, I have the honor to report to the general commanding the Department of the Pacific that I have been in this valley 15 days, carrying out my instructions to chastise these Indians, or the Indians of the Owens River. That I have killed several, taken 11 prisoners, and destroyed a great many rancherias and large quantities of seeds, worms, etc., that the Indians had gathered for food. So, as you can see in this account from George S. Evans, they pretty quickly after this act was passed, uh, the United States and white American citizens were taking Native Americans prisoner to be used in forced labor. And here is the source I get this information from. On top of this, white American gold miners would use the act to enslave Native Americans and force them to pan for gold. Again, we have an excerpt of a first-hand account from an individual whom we don't have a name for, but the first-hand account reads, and I quote, any person could go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children for indenture. The justice determined whether or not compulsory means were used to obtain the child. If the justice was satisfied that no coercion occurred, the person obtained a certificate that authorized him to have the care, custody, control, and earnings of an Indian until their age of majority. For males, 18 years. For females, 15 years. So again, this first-hand account shows just how quickly white Americans were using this act to enslave Native Americans and force them to do labor such as panning for gold. And here's again the information, the source I got this information from. And here's a picture of an enslaved Native American woman panning for gold. Uh, then this brings us to our next section: the systematic genocide of California's Native American peoples by white American gold miners. So this systematic extermination of Native Americans and genocide of Native Americans in California by white American gold miners can be seen to have begun again pretty much immediately after California became a state. But a good example of when this sort of began or became normalized can be seen when Shasta City, California, along with the communities of Marysville and Honey Lake, California, created bounties for Native American scalps. Now, it is important to note that there is no evidence that anyone actually cashed out these bounties or was actually paid these bounties for bringing in Native American scalps. However, regardless of whether or not white American gold miners were paid the bounty, the mere existence of these bounties has major implications for how white Americans in California viewed California's Native American peoples. And these bounties were in place between 1851 and 1866 CE. Uh, and because of this, incentivized by the California government, white American militias would regularly raid Native American villages where they would massacre entire populations and sell the survivors into enslavement between the 1850s and the 1870s CE. One of the first examples we can see uh, is when a group of white American miners were believed to have been killed by local members of the Tolowa Nation, which resulted in a 33-man militia being formed by Crescent City, California, uh, where the militia then proceeded to attack multiple Tolowa villages, resulting in the Tolowa survivors fleeing to a village known as Yontucket Ranch, located on the mouth of Smith's River. However, the militia quickly found and surrounded the survivors, um, where they then proceeded to indiscriminately massacre the Tolowa survivors. An estimated 450 to 600 Tolowa were killed in these attacks, with this event becoming known as the Yontucket Massacre, which occurred sometime in 1853 CE. In fact, Tolowa, this event it was remembered for decades. Is seen in the when Tolowa man Eddie Richards recounted the story of the massacre as told by his family members, stating that a relative told him that, quote, the white people got there about that time. The white people got all around them and around that farm along that big slough. Most of them got on the other side, and when the Indian came across, they got him. The others started in around that house. Every time someone go out, never come back in. People in there began to think, "What's the matter? Never come back." Because when they get down there, they kill them. Afterwards, somebody went out and set fire to all the houses. Every house was burning. They set fire to the houses. The Indian's house. You could see them just cutting heads off. They stick them knives into them. Pretty soon they pick them up and throw them right into the fire. Some of them try to get away, run down the slough. Soon they got down there. If they don't get them right away, they get them from the other side when they come up. Shoot them right there, waiting for them. One fellow say, I sit there while everyone goes out. They jump out. You hear a shot. Hundreds and hundreds in the house trying to get out. Pretty soon I hear fire and everyone's squealing around, all trying to get out. And he said, I got down in the corner of the house. I was a young fellow. I was a scout. I thought to myself, if you gun me, I'll get one of you before you get me. This is my last chance. I'm going to try. I had one of them big elk hides. That's what they used for a coat. That's what they used a long time ago, you know. So he says, I took that and a big long knife tied around here, pointing to wrist, to with buckskin so I can't lose it. One went out. I thought I'm going to go right behind him. He, a white man, shot twice. I threw this thing right out. This big hide. The man shot and said, I'm coming. Knocked two, three of them head off. He said, I went down there in the slaw. Bullets hit all around the top above my head. I don't know how long I stayed under the water. After a couple hundred yards right under water, I get up to get a little air. I could hear people talking. The slope was just like light all over from fire, from the houses burning there. I stayed there 2, 3 hours till daylight. All quiet down. I could hear them people talking and laughing. I looked in the water. The water was just red with blood, with people floating around all over. So, um, again, looking at this account, you can see just the absolute brutality um, and the brutality of the white American gold miners and the ferociousness and viciousness of their actions against the Tolowa peoples. And you can see this is the source that I got this information from. And then later on, in 1854 CE, a member of the Tolowa Nation was suspected of stealing the horse of a white American man. In response, armed white Americans would hide in the brush near Tolowa town at night. At daybreak, the white Americans fired as soon as someone emerged into the village. The women and children of the village were shot indiscriminately. Some Tolowa tried to escape into Lake Earl, but the white Americans pursued them, shooting whenever the Tolowa showed above the waterline. The attackers reported that they killed 65 Tolowa, but this tally did not include the victims whose bodies sank into the lake, with this event becoming known as the Ashulet Massacre. And this event is recounted in a variety of sources, such as a source by an unknown Tolowa informant who recalled the massacre, stating that quote they slaughtered at Yonket, Eshulet, and Jordan Creek. They didn't leave many of us, and the only ones of us that survived are the ones that ran back into the mountain. The informant then went on to state that the survivors found refuge with neighboring villages where, quote, when the slaughtering began, the people went to Mill Creek. They ran to this very tall man. He spoke the language like we did, but we considered it to be broken, and we understood him, but wasn't quite the same. And so they invited us to stay at their lodge for 1 year, and that's how our particular family survived the slaughter. And then we would go down and observe the flats, and they would say, well, they're still killing people, so stay here. And so our family lived there for a year, and then we moved back into the flatlands after it calmed down a bit. So again, showing the absolute brutality and viciousness of the white American miners. Uh, and their brutality of their actions that they inflicted upon the Tolowa peoples. And here is the source that I got this information from. And then between 1856 and 1859 CE, white Americans in Mendocino County would launch regular attacks on the villages of the Yuki Nation. More than 1,000 Yuki are estimated to have been killed. Many others were enslaved, and only 300 are thought to have survived. The intent of this massacre was absolutely to exterminate the Yuki and to gain control of the land that they inhabited. The United States would actually, uncharacteristically, be deployed to the valley to stop the killings, with these events becoming known as the Round Valley Settler Massacres. Uh, there are multiple accounts and sources talking about these events, with one such account coming from the report of the special treasury agent J. Ross Brown from 1861 CE that reads, and I quote, at Round Valley during the winter of 1858 and 1859 CE, more than 150 peaceful Indians, including women and children, were cruelly slaughtered by the whites who had settled there under official authority. Armed parties went into the rancherias in open day when no evil was apprehended and shot the Indians down, weak, harmless, and defenseless as they were, without distinction of age or sex, shot down the women with sucking babes at their breast, killed or crippled the naked children that were running about. I think at this point, viewers can again get the idea of the sheer brutality and viciousness and of the horrific actions uh, of white American miners against the Yuki Nation and other Native American nations in California. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then on February 26, 1860 CE, after a dispute over cattle between white American gold miners and a local village of the Wyatt Nation located at Tulawatt Island near Eureka in Humboldt County, California, um, after this dispute erupted into violence, a small group of white American miners attacked the village, which was defenseless because almost all of the able bodied men were away. To avoid drawing attention from nearby Eureka residents, many of whom actually did not condone the killings, the attackers primarily used hatchets, clubs, and knives. Roughly 80 to 250 Wyatt were killed in the attack, with this event becoming known as the Wyatt Massacre, also known as the Indian Island Massacre. In fact, this massacre is recounted in Arcata's local newspaper, the Northern Californian, which describes the scene as follows. With this newspaper being published in 1860 CE, and it describes the scene as follows: that blood stood in pools on all sides. The walls of the huts were stained in the grass colored red. Lying around were dead bodies of both sexes and all ages, from old man to the infant at the breast. Some had their heads split in twain by axes, others beaten into jelly with clubs, others pierced or cut to pieces with bowie knives. Some struck down as they mired, others almost reached the water when overtaken and butchered. And here's the source that I got this information from, again showing the brutality of white American gold miners. Then during the American Civil War, white Americans in California would continue to conduct slave raids on Native American villages. Uh, of course, later Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would ban California's Native American slavery, at least on paper. However, despite this, the raids and Native American slavery would continue, with the name of Native American slavery simply being changed to indenture, remaining slavery in all but name. Now let's bring this to our next section: the large-scale wars between the United States and California's Native American peoples. Starting with a look at the weapons and warfare of both the Native American peoples of California and the United States. So the weapons and warfare of the California's Native American peoples, of course, varied greatly, with the various weapons being used, including but not being limited to various war clubs, as well as knives, and at some point after contact with, again, depending on region, after contact with Europeans in the United States, various Native American nations in California began to use uh, tomahawks and hatchets. And this is because many Native American nations in California actually did not use tomahawks prior to European contact and contact with the United States. Though, of course, again, this varies because the various tribes in the Southwest, and such as the Sonoran Desert and the Great Basin, very much did use tomahawks prior to this. And of course, after contact with Europeans in the United States, the Native American peoples of California began to use firearms such as muskets, whether they be percussion rifles like this you see here, or flintlocks, and then eventually repeating rifles such as the Winchester rifle. And the Native American peoples of California, of course, generally used bows for both hunting and warfare, and the Native American peoples in the Great Basin and the Southwest, who were generally more cavalry based, began to use, after the introduction of the horse, began to use lances in warfare. And the Native American peoples of California who resided in the Great Basin in the Southwest used uh, um, oftentimes like buckskin shields or other types of leather shields, with the general style of warfare being used being more hit and run tactics that was pretty common across all of North America. And of course, this varies greatly, and due to the sheer number of Native American nations and their diversity, it's not feasible to go over each different strategy and type of warfare battle tactics they used. Then we look at the United States soldiers and weapons, specifically focusing on the time period between the 1840s and 1870s CE. So initially, the United States warfare consisted of infantry units that attacked enemy forces using line battle formations and cavalry used for small scale skirmishes and scouting. However, as the United States expanded into California, the Great Plains, and the Great Basin, the United States cavalry gradually transitioned into a mobile strike force used for paramilitary campaigns against Native American nations. So again, here are the infantry units and the small skirmishing and scouting cavalry. And then after the expansion into California, the Great Plains of the Great Basin, we begin to see mobile paramilitary cavalry units like you see here, which are probably what most people think of when they hear the United States cavalry, thanks to various Western movies. And of course, during this time period, the various weapons used by the United States military varied. Of course, starting with single shot muskets and pistols that were either flintlock or percussion cap, as seen here, before eventually transitioning into various types of revolvers, such as the Colt revolver seen here, with rifles being similarly varied, starting off with muskets and percussion cap rifles, such as this one seen here, before transitioning into repeating rifles, such as the Spencer repeating rifle and eventually the Winchester rifle. And then for close quarters combat, this also varied, with the United States Army initially using, for example, infantrymen using things such as artillery swords and Bowie knives, before artillery swords were phased out, starting in the 1850s and into the Civil War. And of course, initially, officers in the United States military were the ones who primarily had sabers, military sabers. But and this would continue as well after the transition into paramilitary cavalry units, but also after the transition, the various cavalry soldiers began to utilize sabers more frequently as well. All right, now this brings us to the first conflict between the United States military and the Native American peoples of California, that being the Bloody Island Massacre. So, this massacre occurred in 1850 CE when members of the Pomo Nation who were confined to one village were combined to one village where they were starved and abused until they eventually rebelled and murdered their captives. In response to the Pomo Rebellion, Nathaniel Lyons would lead the 1st Dragoons Regiment of the United States Cavalry to attack the Pomo. Lyons' force would kill between 60 to 400 Pomo. This event would become known as the Bloody Island Massacre, and it would occur on May 15th, 1850 CE. And there are multiple primary documents describing the Bloody Island Massacre, with one example coming from William Ralganal Benson, who reports in his account that, quote, many women and children were killed on around this island. One lady, an Indian, told about what she saw while hiding under a bank and under uh, uh, overhanging tullies. She said she saw two white men coming with their guns up in the air, and on their guns hung a little girl. They brought it to the creek and they threw it into the water. A little while later, two more came in the same manner. This time, they had a little boy on the end of their guns, and they also threw it in the water. A little ways from her side, said laid a woman shoot through the shoulder. She held her little baby in her arms. Two white men came running towards the woman and baby. They stabbed the woman and the baby and threw both of them over the bank to the water. She said she heard the woman say, "Oh, my baby." She said when they gathered the dead, they found all the little ones were killed by being stabbed, and many of the women were also killed stabbing. She said it took them 4 or 5 days to gather up the dead, and the dead were all burnt on the east side of the creek. They called it the Island Creek, or Island Creek. Ba Don Bi Da Me. So this shows just how horrific and brutal this massacre was. And here's that source that I got this information from. Then there was the Mariposa War, which began in December of 1850 CE, when white American miners entered the area of the Sierra Nevada foothills, which was traditionally occupied by the Awanichi, a band of the Southern Miwok Nation. I do apologize to any members of the Miwok Nation for butchering that. The white American miners would begin to take over the Ahwanichi's land and resources, leading to tensions between the two groups. The Ahwanichi, led by their chief Tenaya, fought back against the miners, resulting in a series of skirmishes that escalated into a full-scale war. In response to the outbreak of violence between the white American miners and the Ahwanichi, Mariposa County Sheriff James Burney and James T. Savage would lead a militia of 74 white Americans in a retaliatory attack against the Ahwanichi camp on the Fresno River near present-day Oakhurst, California. The militia would attack with rifles at daylight, but were surprised when the Ahwanichi returned fire with rifles and pistols of their own. Surprised and unprepared, Savage's forces would stagger and disperse, resulting in a victory for the Native Americans, who killed several militia members and wounded several more members, and what would become known as the first Battle of the Mariposa War on July 11th, 1851 CE. In response to the outbreak of the Mariposa War, the Mariposa Battalion would be created, with the battalion being a group of men who volunteered to form the Mariposa Battalion, and would be sanctioned by the state of California to rid the area of the perceived threat of Native Americans, with the battalion officially being formed on February 12th, 1851 CE. The battalion would then enter Yosemite Valley and would systematically burn villages and food supplies and force men, women, and children away from their homes. After 2 campaigns, most Awanichi villages and food stores would be destroyed. However, also most Awanichi would be able to elude the militias. However, with the death of their chief, many of the remaining Awanichi would surrender and would be transported onto a reservation, with these 2 campaigns happening between 1851 and 1852 CE. After the remaining Ahwanichi would refuse to come to Camp Balboa, the California government would launch a third campaign against them, with the Mariposa Battalion encircling the Ahwanichi at Lake Tanaja. I apologize to anyone from California if I butchered that. With little prospect of winning, the Awanishi would acquiesce and surrender Yosemite Valley and the surrounding areas to the California government. The battalion would then act as guards and march the Native Americans to the Fresno River Farm Reservation. Shortly after, the Mariposa Battalion would be mustered out, which would then officially end the Mariposa War. With these events happening between May 22nd, and July 1st of 1852 CE. Then we have the Mendocino War. So the building blocks of what would become the Mendocino War really began in 1856 CE when the California government would start the Nome Colt Farm and the Mendocino Indian Reservation in Mendocino County, California, with the intention of removing the local members of the Yuki Nation to them. On top of this, the continued kidnapping and stealing of Native American women and children to subjugate them to servitude or sexual abuse, along with the destruction of Yuki land by white American ranchers and their cattle, would result in the outbreak of violence between the Yuki and the local white American ranchers, with this violence happening between 1856 and 1859 CE. As the conflict reached a boiling point, Judge Serenus Clinton Hastings would make the executive decision to move all of the remaining Yuki to the Mendocino Reservation. He did this more to save his property than for the protection of the Yuki. Judge Hastings and 39 white American settlers would then petition the governor of California, John B. Wheeler, for help in protecting the white American settlers from the Yuki attacks, with this petition happening in June of 1859 CE. However, Hastings would grow tired of waiting for a response from the governor, and would then go on to create a new company anyway without federal funding. The company is often referred to as the Eel River Rangers. The Eel River Rangers would go on to kill 283 warriors and would capture 292 warriors, and then would kill countless women and children, and would only suffer 5 casualties themselves in over 23 engagements. The total damage done to the Yuki and other Native American communities is incalculable. And these massacres and captures would happen and engagements would happen between July of 1859 to January of 1860 CE. Then we have the Owens Valley War. So, in the Owens Valley of California, large storms would result in large-scale flooding known as the Great Flood of 1862 CE. The flooding combined with cold water would then result in the local communities of the Paiute Nation to suffer the loss of much of the game they depended on. Additionally, the cattle driven into the Owens Valley to feed the white American miners would begin to compete with native grazers. And they would also eat native wild plant crops the Paiute Nation would irrigate and depend on as a staple to survive, with all this, of course, taking place in 1862 CE. Starving, the Paiute would begin to kill the cattle and attack the American cattlemen sometime in January of 1862 CE. The Paiute would then ally with the Kwaisu Nation. I apologize to any members of the nation if I butchered that. And the Shoshone Nation against the United States. In response to the attacks on American cattlemen, the 2nd California Cavalry Regiment would then launch multiple attacks on the Paiute, Kwaisu, and Shoshone nations. These attacks would result in roughly 200 Paiute, Kwaisu, and Shoshone being killed. These attacks will become known as the Owens Valley War, with these attacks happening between 1862 and 1867 CE. Then we have the Modoc War. So the building blocks of what would become known as the Modoc War began when the Modoc Nation and the Klamath Nation signed the Great Treaty of Council Grove, ceding millions of acres of land to the United States and agreed to move to the Klamath Reservation within the boundaries of present-day Oregon on 1864. Sorry, in 1864 CE. And here is the Modoc and Klamath nations, and here is the Klamath Reservation. Shortly after the Modoc Nation began building their homes in the Klamath Reservation, the Klamath, longtime rivals of the Modoc Nation, would begin to steal the Modoc Nation's lumber. The Modoc Nation would complain to the United States, but the United States Indian agents could not, and also very likely refused to protect the Modoc Nation against the Klamath. In response to this, Modoc leader Kent Puash, I apologize if I butchered that, would lead a group of 200 Modoc back to the Modoc's homeland in the Lost River region in 1870 CE. Fearing that Kent Puash's Modoc would begin raiding homesteads, white Americans in the Lost River region would go on to petition the United States Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon, Alfred B. Meacham, asking him to return Kent Puash's Modoc to the Klamath Reservation. Meacham initially recommended to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., that Kent Puash's Modoc be given a separate reservation at Yinax in the lower southern part of the Klamath Reservation. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs never responded to Meacham's request for a separate reservation for the Modoc. After hearing more complaints from settlers, Meacham instead requested General Edward Kenby to move Kent Puash's Modoc to Yinax on the Klamath Reservation, with all this happening in April of 1872 CE. Wishing to avoid conflict, Kent Puash would agree to go to the reservation, but the situation would go on to become tense when the United States Army demanded the Modoc leader surrender his weapons. Kent Puash and the Modoc would initially reluctantly agree. However, a fight between Modoc warrior Scarface Charlie and a lieutenant in the United States Army would lead to an outbreak of hostilities between Kent Puash's Modoc and the United States Army, with the Modoc quickly fleeing the battle, heading for California, where they would make the lava fields of Tule Lake their stronghold, with this event becoming known as the Battle of Lost River, which occurred on July 6, 1872 CE. And real quick, this is Scarface Charlie, and this is the lava beds of Tule Lake. After several minor skirmishes, the United States would then order Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton, Major John Green, and Captain Reuben F. Bernard to lead a force of 400 United States soldiers to attack Kent Puash's stronghold on January 17th, 1873 CE. Despite being outnumbered, Kent Puash and 53 Modoc were able to use the lava bed's rough terrain as well as hit and run tactics to slow down the United States Army. Later, Kent Puash's force would use the combination of heavy fog as well as the rocky terrain of the lava beds to form a strong defensive position, with all of these tactics allowing Kent Puash's force to inflict heavy casualties on the United States Army and would also eventually allow them to defeat the United States Army itself, with this event becoming known as the First Battle of the Stronghold, with it again occurring on January 17th, 1873 CE. After the defeat of the United States in the First Battle of the Stronghold, the United States Secretary of Interior, Columbus Delano, would appoint a peace commission to negotiate with Kent Puash. Delano would then go on to appoint United States General Edward Canby as the counselor of the commission. Kent Puash was initially willing to negotiate with the commission. However, the refusal of the United States to give Kent Puash's Modoc the lava beds as a reservation, and the insistence of the United States that the Modoc return to the Klamath Reservation would eventually result in Kent Powassan ordering the assassination of Canby, which then would reignite hostilities between Kent Powassan and the United States, with these peace talks and eventual assassination happening between January 25th and April 11th, 1873 CE. After the reignition of hostilities, Kent Powassan's force would return to their strongholds in the lava fields, where they would continue to hold off the United States for a time before Kent Powassan's Modoc were forced to retreat due to the United States Army uh, cutting them off from their water supply. This would end the Second Battle of the Stronghold in a United States victory on April 17th, 1873 CE. However, Kent Powassan's Modoc were able to ambush and defeat a force of 70 United States soldiers and 12 Allied Native Americans in the Battle of Sand Butte on April 26th, 1873 CE. Then, on May 10th, 1873 CE, a small detachment of Modoc warriors attempted to ambush a camp of United States soldiers, but were eventually defeated and forced to retreat. This event would go on to become known as the Battle of Dry Lake and was the last major battle of the war. Kent Powassan and several of his lead warriors would then eventually be captured, with Kent Powassan and three of his lead warriors being tried and executed by the United States. And then Kent Powassan's Modoc would then be divided and sent to Oklahoma Indian Territory and the Klamath Reservation in Oregon. And this would officially end what would become known as the Modoc War. With these events, the trial, execution, and the division and removal of Kent Powassan's Modoc to these reservations occurring between May 10th and October 3rd, 1873 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, the cultural genocide of California's Native American peoples. Because cultural genocide and outright genocide, i.e., the massacring of entire populations, always go hand in hand. So, starting in the 1860s and well into 1900 CE, with the 20th century, the United States would forcibly remove California's Native American peoples to reservations. Uh, During this, California's Native American peoples would suffer greatly and often die as a result of these forced removals to reservations, as seen in the Concal Trail of Tears, where 184 members of the Concal Nation would die on the way to the Round Valley Reservation at Covella in Mendocino County, California. With the Concal Trail of Tears occurring between August 28th and September 18th of 1863 CE. And then between the 1870s and the 1990s CE, yeah, literally just like 30 years ago, the Native American children in California would be forced to attend Native American boarding schools where they were forcibly assimilated into white American culture uh, and were forced to face brutal treatment and disease at these boarding schools, with many of the Native American children dying at these Native American boarding schools. And I've already done a video on the Native American boarding school system and the cultural genocide of Native Americans, which I'll include in the iCard. And here are some pictures of what these boarding schools look like and the sort of tasks that Native American children were forced to do. And on top of this, in 1909 CE, the California state government would establish the California Eugenics Record Office, which promoted the forced sterilization of people declared by the government to be unfit, including Black, Latino, and Native American women who were incarcerated or placed in state institutions for disabilities. And I really want everyone watching this to take a look at this uh, uh, document right here, because this is a document recommending sterilization of a Native American individual. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the aftermath of the genocide of California's Native American peoples. So, one very important thing to drive home is that uh, is the sheer scope of the genocide of California's Native American peoples. For example, the population of the Native American peoples of California declined from an estimated 300,000 in 1770 CE to an estimated 150,000 in 1845 CE. And then it declined from an estimated 150,000 in 1845 CE to an estimated 15 to 30,000 in 1910 CE. So, so just under the administration of the United States, the population of the Native American peoples of California declined to drastically to leaving only 10 to 20% of the initial population of Native Americans that were present when the United States gained California. And of course, yes, to anybody watching, that's, still not taking into account all of the Native Americans who died as a result of genocide at the hands of the Spanish Empire and the Republic of Mexico. But that's two different colonial empires versus all of the Native Americans who died as a result of the policies of the United States government, a singular colonial empire. On top of this, the Native American peoples of California would lose most of their ancestral homelands to the United States. Now, I want everyone watching this to really focus and take a minute to absorb all of these maps, starting with this map here of the all of the land held by the Native American peoples of California, and yes, by Native American peoples in all of the United States, but we're focusing on California right now. All of the Native American peoples of California. Uh, this is all the land they held in 1841. And then this is the land they held, all the land they held just 10 years later. Look at how much land the Native American peoples of California lost to the United States in just 10 years. And then this, again, is all of the land that the Native American peoples of California lost, and really all of the West Coast lost to the United States in just 15 years, going from 1851 to 1866. And this is all the land that they lost from 1866 just to 1873. It's just 7 years. And this is all the land that the Native American peoples of California and the United States as a whole lost to the United States by 1877. So again, just under 14 years. They lost basically all of their land, with the exception of the reservations here. And then even then, they lost that most of those reservations to the United States in the 100 some odd years between 1887, 120 some odd years from 1887 to 2010. So really take a minute to go back to focus on these maps and just to show just how devastating the expansion of the United States was to the Native American peoples of California and the United States as a whole. And then another notable legacy in aftermath of the genocide of California's Native American peoples is that various Native American scholars, such as Native American scholar Gerald Weisenor, have argued for universities to be authorized to assemble tribunals to investigate the California genocide, with Weisenor himself stating that, quote, genocide tribunals would provide venues of judicial reason and equity that reveal continental ethnic cleansings, mass murder, torture, and religious persecution, past and present, and would justly expose, in the context of legal competition for evidence, the insiders, falsifiers, and deniers of genocide and state crimes against Native American Indians. Genocide tribunals would surely enhance the moot court programs in law schools and provide more serious consideration of human rights in international criminal cases by substantive testimony, motivated historical depositions, documentary evidence, contentious narratives, and ethical accountability. So, in essence, Weisner and other Native American scholars are saying, hey, we need to actually hold trials similar to, say, the Nuremberg trials to investigate this genocide. And my response to that is like, I agree. Why hasn't this happened? Why hasn't this happened yet? Or at all? All right, now this brings us to our last section, the Native American peoples of California today. So, today in the modern era, at this moment, the moment this video is being filmed, there are 100 federally recognized Native American nations in California and many more who are not recognized by the federal government. Now, admittedly, a lot of these are just white people of my complexion, me being white, who are trying to claim Native American heritage without actually having it. But some have Native American heritage, but for various reasons have either chosen not to become federally recognized, or due to, say, clerical errors, don't have the documents to be federally recognized. But regardless, they exist. And you can see that in this map here and this map here. And the Native American peoples of California continue to maintain and preserve their cultural practices despite previous and continued attempts by the United States to eradicate it. I think that is always very important to point out is that while it is not is well known, it's not in the mainstream media necessarily. The cultural genocide of Native Americans is still happening to some degree. The United States is always uh, and white Americans are always trying to some degree to eradicate the cultural practices and cultural identities of Native Americans. And despite all of that, the Native American peoples of California and the United States as a whole are maintaining and preserving their cultural practices. All right, that ends our final video in the series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. As with every other video in the series, I really I hope that you enjoyed learning about the cultures of and cultural practices uh, and pre-contact, pre-colonial history of the Native American peoples of California. But I really, really hope you did not enjoy reading or hearing about all the atrocities and genocide and massacres and brutal treatments of the Native American peoples of California at the hands of the United States. Again, as with all the previous videos in the series, I understand that it's an odd thing to hear the person, myself, recording the video, asking for you not to enjoy those parts. But the reason I say that is because I'm making this video and the other videos in the series not for entertainment, but for education. These videos, this video and all the videos in the series are made to bring to light events that are often overlooked, downplayed, or outright ignored in United States history. Events that were horrific, events that the United States, many people in the United States would prefer not to be heard about, because it's again, there's just no way to put it, other way to put it. They're horrific things that were crimes against humanity, and they should never have happened. And so it's important to bring these things up to make videos educating people about these so that we can learn about it and educate other people about these events, and so that we can learn from the past and make sure that these events never happen again, so that we can make sure that the brutality brought against Native Americans never by the United States or any colonial power never happens again. So with that, I'm going to end the video and end the series on early United States imperial expansion. If you want to see me cover any of the things I discussed in the video in greater detail in later videos, please remember to please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.